It's good to see everyone this morning. Now, on the 9th of August, we're having a celebration of life for Norm. And as you probably most of you know, he passed away a week ago. So that's going to be at 3 o'clock at the VFW in Newport Richey. And if you need directions, just ask Kim. She'll tell you how to get there. The actual name of the place.
I'll bring the flyer next week.
All right, we'll bring a flyer next week. That'll be good. All right. This wind does blow these pages around.
It really does.
All right, so we're in the book of Esther, which is a very interesting book, and a little bit of a racy book, right? And when you're preaching, it's hard to know how direct I should be about what's happening in the story, especially if there's kids in the crowd. So I try to use language that's not too offensive to anybody. But it's a wild story, and there's a lot of issues happening in the story that are still issues in the world today. A lot of people have issues with sexuality and sexual issues in their life. And I found out when I first started preaching that people that don't like hearing about it makes them uncomfortable. I thought when I started becoming a preacher, I thought I'm going to be able to talk about people's sexual issues because nobody else is, and it's so important. So many of us, the greatest challenges we face are in that area of our life, and it's just ignored by the church. But I found out pretty quick that you saying the word sex during church scares people away. So when I was at the old church in the barn, like the first Sunday of May every year, I'd say, today is Sex Sunday, we're going to talk about sex. And people would get upset, and sometimes mad sometimes, or stop coming to church. And just the word, the idea, the topic just scares so many people. That always surprised me because my family was very open about talking about sexual issues. And my dad was homosexual. And he had 5 kids, married 25 years, and then he went off into the lifestyle that he had felt in his heart for his whole life since he was a child. And he was a good dad, and I loved him. I still do. He's passed away, of course, now. But I know that these type of issues are in many people's families. Most of us, either ourselves or someone we know in our family has been abused in some way. And God can bring healing when we confront those issues and talk about them. So I'm thankful that the Bible does deal with those issues. And in the book of Esther, a lot of that's going on. We learned last week about Queen Vashti, who was very brave. Her husband, the king, Ahasuerus, he wanted her to come out at a banquet, at a party. Remember, they had a party that lasted 6 months long. Then they added another week to the party. He wanted her to come out and show her beauty and her sexiness. Probably wanted her to dance or something. We don't know exactly why. In front of a bunch of rich, powerful, drunk men. And she says, no, I'm not going to do that. Which was risking her life. So King Ahasuerus said to her, you're not going to be my queen anymore. You're going to just go back to the harem, just live there alone. And if you lived in a harem in those days, there were hundreds of women in these harems. These women were taken from their families, taken from their homes, and forced to live in the palace. Yeah, they ate real good. They got taken care of physically real good. But they had no hope of falling in love or finding a husband or having a family. And if they were one of the king's favorites, they probably just sat in the harem all the time with nothing to do, almost like being in prison. So it was a type of, what do they call that today? Sexual trafficking, human trafficking, and sexual enslavement. So it was not a good thing at all. But Esther found her way into this harem because when the king was looking for a new wife or a new queen, he searched the entire kingdom. And remember, the kingdom had 127 provinces, 127. And it stretched from Africa all the way to India. The Persian Empire was the largest empire that had existed at that time. And they searched the whole empire for the most beautiful women they could find. And one of those women they found was this young Jewish woman named Esther. Now they didn't know she was Jewish. She kept that hidden from them. But they took her and put her in the harem, and they spent a year making her even more beautiful, giving her daily spa treatments. That sounds good in a way, right? I know I get a pedicure once in a while, and that's really an enjoyable experience. I'd have my wife do it for me, but she doesn't like doing that so much. That's funny. So she was in this harem for a year, just getting ready to see the king. Then the king would take the women in one night, and give them a test drive and see if he liked them or not. But Esther was a remarkable woman. We'll see that it says that she was beautiful in the face and also had a lovely, what they say in some translations, a lovely figure. And apparently she was a great personality as well. And she really got noticed. She was beautiful inside and out. And she was in a terrible place to be. But yet God had put her there, and put her there for a reason. Because she saved the Jewish nation from being exterminated. She saved them from a genocide. So no matter what situation you're in life, God has got a plan. He's got a plan and a purpose for why you're there, for what's going on in your life. So I'm going to start reading today, chapter 2 of Esther, and we'll see what it says. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, which was the capital of Persia, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and so he did so. Now, so at the beginning of the chapter, it says, after these things. So some time has passed. A few years has passed between the first chapter of Esther, when the queen was vanquished, and the second chapter of Esther, where he's choosing a new queen. About 4 years had passed. And, you know, the Bible lines right up with his secular history and with archaeology. Did you guys see that movie called The 300? It was about 300 Spartans that fought against the Persian army. And the Persian army was just trying to invade Europe. And the small group of 300 Spartans, they were Greeks, they stopped the Persian army from invading Europe. That's a famous historical event that actually happened. And it happened right in between the first chapter of Esther and the second chapter of Esther. So the king had been so busy fighting, trying to get into Europe, he didn't have time to choose a new queen. And then it says, chapter 2, after these things, when his anger had abated, that's when they started looking for a new queen. So that's kind of an interesting historical thing that happened there. Also, you notice the harem was attended by eunuchs. We talked about eunuchs a few months ago in the book of Acts. One of the very first people that got saved, one of the very first people that God sent a missionary to witness to was a eunuch. And a eunuch is a person that has a sexual orientation that is basically doesn't need to have sex or romance in their life. And Jesus said something about eunuchs. He said some people are born eunuchs. That's their sexual orientation from their birth. They didn't choose it. They didn't be forced upon them in any way. They were born that way. And then he says some people are made eunuchs by the hands of men. And we know what that means in those days, that they would basically castrate a man, and that way he would grow up and not develop fully and not have a sexual drive of much. And he said some people become eunuchs by choice. So I think Jesus was telling us something important here, that some people are born with a certain sexual orientation. And some people are made that way from the way they're treated in their life. And some people actually choose to go down a road that leads them to that position. I believe that's what Jesus was telling us. I think it's very interesting that in the book of Acts, one of the very first people that God sent somebody to save, in fact, the first individual that God sent someone to save was an African eunuch. So in this story, we see not only the sexual trafficking involved in kidnapping these young women and making them go into the harem, but we also see adult men that were eunuchs who had been surgically altered so that they could be in charge of the harem. It makes sense to the king if he wants men to be in charge of his harem. If he puts a regular everyday guy with a large amount of testosterone flowing through his blood in charge of the harem, you can see what kind of problems might come up. So that's why they made eunuchs and had eunuchs in charge of the harem. All right, so I said it's a little dicey today, but there's no kids here, so I hope I don't offend anybody by telling what I see in the Bible. All right, so they were in Susa, the capital of Persia, and that remained the capital of Persia until Alexander the Great conquered it in 332 BC. And the Persians never did conquer Europe. They never got into Europe. All right, now, this is verse 5 now, chapter 2. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shemiel, the son of Kish, the Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem during the captivity with Jeconiah the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. All right, so this is kind of confusing when you read it, but what happened was, about 100 years before this story happened, the Babylonians had conquered Judah, conquered Jerusalem, and they took captive a whole lot of people. And now this family with Mordecai has been several generations living in Babylon and now in Persia. They hadn't been back to their home in Jerusalem in Israel for 100 years, and 4 generations have passed. Now the king of Persia, when he first became king, he told the Jews, you may go back to Jerusalem if you want to. In fact, he paid for the city to be rebuilt. He paid for the temple to be rebuilt. And he said, you may go back. And you read those stories in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But you know that most Jewish people that were living in Babylon and Persia stayed there because they were born there, and their parents were born there, and their grandparents were born there, and they felt that was their home. So they kept a large Jewish community in that area, and to this day there's Jewish people living in those areas. Now in the modern world, Babylon is Iraq, and Persia is Iran. So we see a lot of parallels to what's happening in the world today. So this Jew in Susa, his name was Mordecai. He'd been there for a long time. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther. So her Jewish name was Hadassah. But many of the captives that were taken, they had the Jewish name taken away, and they were given a Persian or Babylonian name. So her name Esther is that Persian name. It means morning star. And we know in the Bible that Jesus is called the bright morning star. So we see in the book of Esther, a young woman being used to represent Jesus Christ. And how was she like Jesus? Well, she was a virgin. She was innocent. Just like Jesus was totally innocent, had no sin in his life. She was perfect in her personality and perfect in her looks and her body. And Jesus was the perfect Lamb of God that gave his life for us. Just like Jesus, Esther appeared before the authorities and asked for freedom for the people. And Jesus appeared before the authorities and was crucified to bring us freedom for sin. So I want you to always think of Esther as a type of Christ, as a prophetic picture of what Jesus will do for us. So this man, Mordecai, he was bringing up Hadassah, who was called Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had no father or mother. So Esther was the cousin to Mordecai. And Mordecai was older. He raised her because her parents died. We don't know how her parents died, But here's this young, beautiful woman who's been taken captive, who's already had such a hard life because her parents died. She had to grow up without mom and dad. So she obviously had some great strength within her to get through all that. I know many of you have been through things where you've lost family members, and you had to weep and mourn and get through that, and let God bring that strength and power into your life through the experience. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the capital, in the custody of the eunuch Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And this young woman, Esther, she pleased Haggai, and she won his favor. So this is a woman that was so remarkable that this eunuch, who wasn't after her for her looks or wasn't after her for her body, he was so impressed with her, totally impressed with her. He wanted to help her to become the queen. So she won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food. And with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. He was so impressed. I think about the amount of money they spend on these harems. If they're having 7 women there to take care of this one woman out of the hundreds in the harem, how much expense they went to, how much trouble they went to have these harems and maintain them. We know even in the nation of Israel they had harems. King David and then later his son, King Solomon, both of them each had about 1,000 wives and concubines in their harem. This was common practice in those days. Now sometimes I laugh about how different it is today. If you are like the President of the United States, you are a very powerful person, similar to a King of Persia. But today, if you have a wife, that's it. You got one wife, that's it. Just because you're powerful, if you have an affair even for a day with somebody, boy, they really tear you down, right? If you're the president. I just thought it was an interesting contrast, how things are today in the world. Esther had not made her people known or her kinship, for Mordecai commanded her not to make it known. So he told her, he said, look, Esther, do not tell them that you're Jewish. Don't let them know that. Apparently there was some anti-Semitism at work, even in these days, against the Jewish people. And every day, Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was doing and what was happening to her. So Mordecai was obviously, he was living in the capital, Susa, and he was walking around the palace and the courtyards. Probably he had a job. He probably worked for the government and was there in that area because he walked by every day to check on Esther, to ask how she was doing, what was happening. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into the king as her heiress, after being 12 months of the regulations, since this was a regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, when the women went into the king in this way. She was getting whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. So there was a year of preparation before they got there one night to basically audition. And it was basically a rape because these women were not there by their choice. And they had 12 months of this training. And they were young, innocent women, virgins. So I'm sure that part of the training they received was on sexual activity or how to please a person in bed. So they had 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments. So they were really trying to beautify these women and make their skin look really good and nice and soft and everything they could to take young women that were already very beautiful and make them just even more so. So when they went to the king, they took whatever they desired with them. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, but if they're going into the king for one night of sex, and they want to please him as good as they can, and then it says they're allowed to take stuff from the harem with them, probably something to make the sex better, right? Okay, getting carried away a little bit with the Bible. But you can imagine what went on here. When the young woman went into the king this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in the morning, she would return to the second harem in custody of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again, unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So they got the one night, then they went back to a second harem where they just stood and just lived there every day and waited to see if the king would call them back in. When the time came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, when it was Esther's time to go into the king, she asked for nothing except for what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charged the woman, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. When Esther was taken into King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So he just fell head over heels for Esther and made her the queen, put a crown on her head. And he was so happy that he actually gave a tax break to people in his provinces and gave away many gifts, had a banquet to celebrate. Now it's going to shift gears a little bit, this last little part of this chapter. There's a little sub-story that happens here involving Mordecai. So let's look at that. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought out by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry, and they sought to lay hands on the king. So, two people are going to try to kill the king, get rid of the king. They were angry, they hated the king, and they wanted to kill him. They made a plot to kill the king. This came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. It was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So there we have a little sub-story. Mordecai found out a plot to kill the king. He told Esther about it, and Esther told the king and saved the life of the king. And that's another story that's going to come back later in the book to show us what God's plan was, what God's will was. So these two guys were hung. Kind of reminds me of Jesus being on the cross with two people hung from the cross on either side of him. There was a criminal on either side of him. There's many parallels to the story of Jesus in the book of Esther. And I think that Esther, like every other book in the Old Testament, is prophetic in a sense, that it represents coming of Jesus and foretells the coming of Jesus. Well, I'm going to wrap it up today. I got through that second chapter pretty good. And let me get my stand right here. I always like to ask every Sunday, if anyone has not received Christ, they can do it today. If anyone's never said to the Lord, I know I'm a sinner, I need my sins forgiven. I want to invite your Holy Spirit to live in my heart. And I want to live my life as a true Christian, following the teachings of Jesus, and serving you the rest of my life. If anyone here today would like to say that, now it's time to come up forward and pray with me, as many people have.